Almost every culture on Earth, separated by oceans and thousands of years, somehow imagined the exact same creature. Tonight, we explore why dragons appear in nearly every mythology on the planet, and how different they truly are. Welcome to tonight's journey across the ancient world, chasing a single question that has quietly puzzled historians and mythologists for generations. Long before ships could cross oceans, long before distant civilizations ever exchanged a single word or story, something strange was happening on opposite sides of the planet at almost exactly the same time. In China, storytellers spoke of a long, serpentine creature commanding rivers and rain. In Europe, warriors told tales of a scaled beast guarding treasure deep within a mountain. In the highlands of Mesoamerica, priests carved the image of a feathered serpent into temple stone. None of these people had ever met. None of them had ever read each other's stories, or traded goods, or shared a single language. And yet, somehow, they all arrived at strikingly similar imagined creatures, powerful, reptilian, often winged, often tied closely to water, weather, or the boundary between earth and heaven. Tonight we are going to slowly travel through these separate traditions, one at a time, exploring how each culture imagined its own version of this creature, what it meant to them, and why, again and again, completely isolated civilizations kept arriving at something so remarkably similar. We will look closely at how a shared imagined creature could take on such wildly different personalities depending on where it was born. We will begin in East Asia, with one of the oldest and most detailed dragon traditions still practiced and celebrated today, a tradition that looks, in nearly every important way, almost nothing like the fire-breathing villain most Western audiences picture when they hear the word dragon at all. In Chinese mythology, the dragon holds a position almost entirely opposite from the fire-breathing villain many people picture today. Far from being feared or hunted, the Chinese dragon, known as Long, was considered a benevolent, sacred symbol of power, wisdom, and imperial authority, closely associated with rain, rivers, and the fertility of the land itself. Ancient Chinese farmers depended heavily on seasonal rainfall, and dragons were believed to control it directly, living within rivers, lakes, and deep wells, rising into storm clouds when the time came to bring rain to parched fields below. Elaborate rituals and festivals developed specifically to honor these dragon spirits, some still practiced today in the form of dragon dances and dragon boat races held during particular times of the year. The Chinese dragon's physical form differs considerably from its European counterpart too. Rather than a heavy, four-legged beast with membranous wings, the Long is typically depicted as a long, sinuous, wingless body, moving through air and water with equal grace, closer in spirit to a river current given living form than to a heavily armored predator. Chinese emperors eventually adopted the dragon as a personal symbol of their authority, wearing dragon robes and sitting upon dragon thrones, a direct visual claim connecting imperial power to this same ancient, revered creature governing the natural forces their entire agricultural society depended upon. This connection between dragon and emperor grew so strong over centuries that ordinary citizens were eventually forbidden from wearing clothing decorated with the five-clawed imperial dragon design, a symbol reserved exclusively for the ruling family, underscoring just how deeply this creature had become woven into the very structure of Chinese political and spiritual life. Traveling west across the continent into medieval Europe, the story shifts dramatically. Here, the dragon transforms into something considerably more sinister, a dangerous, often malevolent creature associated with greed, chaos, and destruction rather than benevolent natural power. European dragons typically guard hoarded treasure deep within caves or mountains, a detail appearing repeatedly across numerous separate medieval tales and epic poems. The Old English epic Beowulf features one of the most famous examples. An ancient dragon awakened after a stolen goblet disturbs its carefully guarded treasure hoard, ultimately leading to a final, fatal confrontation with the poem's aging hero. St. George, meanwhile, became forever associated with dragon slaying through a legend describing a heroic rescue of a princess from a terrorizing dragon, a story that spread widely across medieval Christian Europe and remains celebrated in various forms even today. Unlike the Chinese long, European dragons are almost always depicted with substantial wings, for powerful legs, and a heavily armored, scaled body built for destruction rather than graceful movement through water or sky. Fire breathing became a particularly common trait within this specific tradition, adding an additional layer of danger to an already fearsome creature associated closely with chaos, corruption, and the forces a righteous hero was expected to overcome. This dramatic difference in symbolism, sacred protector in one tradition, dangerous villain in another, offers one of the clearest illustrations of just how differently separate cultures interpreted essentially the same core imagined creature, shaped heavily by their own particular values, fears, and religious frameworks. Norse mythology contributes its own distinctive dragon figures, deeply woven into the broader mythological framework of the Viking world. Perhaps most famous among them is Nidhogg, a massive serpent-like dragon said to gnaw eternally at the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree believed to connect all 9 realms of Norse cosmology together. This gnawing was not simply destructive for its own sake within the mythology, but represented an ongoing cosmic tension, a constant, grinding threat against the very structure holding the Norse universe together, a detail reflecting the broader Norse worldview that even the foundations of reality itself faced constant, active challenge rather than settled, permanent stability. Another significant Norse dragon figure, Fafnir, began mythologically as a dwarf who transformed into a dragon after becoming consumed by greed over a cursed treasure hoard, eventually slain by the hero Sigurd in one of the most retold stories within the entire Norse mythological tradition. This transformation from greedy individual into monstrous dragon reinforced a recurring theme found across several dragon traditions: greed and hoarding wealth leading to monstrous, destructive consequences. Viking longships themselves frequently featured carved dragon heads on their prows, intended partly to intimidate enemies and partly to invoke protective, powerful symbolism as these ships crossed dangerous open water on long voyages far from home. This practice gave rise to the very term longship enthusiasts and historians still use today, the dragon-headed ship, a design choice that fused practical seafaring with deep mythological meaning, turning an ordinary vessel into something believed capable of drawing on the same fearsome power the Norse associated with these ancient, serpentine creatures. Let us pause here for a moment and simply rest in the quiet space between these different traditions. Picture, for a moment, 3 entirely separate scenes unfolding at once, though separated by vast oceans and centuries of time. A misty Chinese river at dawn, where villagers once believed a dragon spirit rested beneath the still water. A shadowed European cave, deep within some forgotten mountain, where old stories once imagined gold glittering beneath a sleeping, scaled guardian. A vast, ancient tree at the center of the Norse cosmos, its roots slowly gnawed by something patient and eternal. Three civilizations, three entirely different interpretations, yet all circling back toward remarkably similar imagery, a great reptilian creature, tied closely to power, danger, and forces considerably larger than any single person. Nothing here connects these three scenes directly, no shared trade route, no exchanged story, no common ancestor culture linking them together. And yet the same fundamental shape keeps appearing, again and again, drawn independently by imaginations separated by entire oceans and centuries of history, arriving at conclusions eerily close to one another despite never once being able to compare notes. We will continue shortly, traveling next into Japan, where the dragon takes on its own particular character, shaped by centuries of unique cultural and religious tradition, closely tied to yet distinct from the Chinese tradition we have just explored. Japanese dragon mythology, known as Ryu, draws considerable influence from Chinese tradition while still developing its own distinct character and symbolism over centuries of independent cultural development. Like their Chinese counterparts, Japanese dragons are generally viewed as benevolent, powerful beings associated closely with water, rain, and the sea, rather than adopting the destructive, treasure-hoarding reputation found throughout European tradition. Ryujin, the Japanese dragon god of the sea, holds a particularly significant place within Japanese mythology, said to rule over a magnificent underwater palace and control the ocean's tides using magical jewels capable of commanding the ebb and flow of water itself. Ryujin appears throughout numerous traditional Japanese folktales, often interacting directly with human heroes, sometimes offering assistance, sometimes testing the courage and character of those who encounter him. Japanese dragons are typically depicted with 3 claws, a subtle but meaningful distinction from Chinese dragons, which traditionally carry 5, a difference some scholars believe reflects deliberate cultural distinction as the mythology spread and evolved independently after initially arriving from mainland China centuries earlier. Shinto shrines across Japan frequently incorporate dragon imagery into their architecture and decoration, reflecting the creature's deep, ongoing spiritual significance within Japanese religious and cultural life, a reverence that has persisted continuously for well over 1,000 years. Even today, dragon imagery remains woven throughout Japanese festivals, artwork, and popular culture, a living continuation of a tradition that, much like its Chinese counterpart, never cast the dragon as a monster to be feared, but rather as a powerful, protective force deserving genuine respect and careful reverence. Crossing an entire ocean to Mesoamerica, an entirely separate and independently developed dragon tradition emerges, one with no historical contact whatsoever connecting it to any of the Asian or European traditions covered so far. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god central to Aztec, Mayan, and several other Mesoamerican belief systems, represents one of the most visually striking and philosophically complex dragon-like figures found anywhere in world mythology. Depicted as a serpent covered in vibrant feathers, Quetzalcoatl combined the imagery of 2 entirely separate animals, a snake representing the earth and the underworld, and a bird representing sky and heaven, merging them into one single, unified divine figure associated with wind, learning, and the morning star. This combination reflected a broader philosophical idea common across several Mesoamerican traditions, the merging of opposing forces, earth and sky, darkness and light, into a single, balanced whole. Elaborate temples throughout Mexico and Central America still bear Quetzalcoatl's image today, carved carefully into stone facades and staircases, some architectural designs even engineered so that sunlight during specific seasonal events creates the illusion of a serpent slithering down the temple steps, a deliberate, sophisticated blending of astronomy, architecture, and religious symbolism entirely unique to this particular tradition. This precise alignment, still observable today at certain ancient sites during the spring and autumn equinox, demonstrates a level of astronomical understanding considerably more advanced than many outside observers historically assumed, further reinforcing that this feathered serpent tradition developed through careful, independent intellectual effort rather than any borrowed influence from distant cultures. Slavic mythology offers yet another independent dragon tradition, developed across Eastern Europe with its own distinct characteristics separate from both the Western European and Norse traditions covered earlier. The Zmej, a multi-headed dragon figure appearing throughout Slavic folklore, typically represents chaos and destruction, often depicted terrorizing villages, demanding tribute, or kidnapping princesses in stories that echo, yet remain distinctly separate from, similar hero versus dragon narratives found elsewhere across Europe. Unlike the single-headed dragons common in Western European tales, Slavic dragons frequently possess multiple heads, sometimes 3, sometimes as many as 7 or 9, each head occasionally capable of regenerating if severed, adding a particularly challenging obstacle for the various heroic figures tasked with defeating them throughout different regional folktales. Some Slavic traditions also feature more benevolent dragon figures, guardian spirits protecting specific rivers, forests, or communities, existing alongside the more commonly known destructive Zmej figures within the same broader mythological framework, a duality echoing the mixed, complicated reputation dragons seem to carry across nearly every culture that has ever imagined them. These regional variations often blended together as stories traveled between neighboring communities across Eastern Europe, producing an especially rich, layered body of folklore, with local legends occasionally combining elements of both the fearsome Zmej and gentler guardian traditions into a single, complex regional tale passed down across many generations. Stepping back now across everything covered so far, a genuinely striking pattern begins to emerge. Chinese long, ruling rivers and rain. Japanese Ryu, governing the sea from an underwater palace. European dragons, guarding treasure deep within mountain caves. Norse serpents, gnawing at the roots of the world tree itself. Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl, merging serpent and bird into unified divine symbolism. Slavic Zmej, embodying chaos and destruction across multiple regenerating heads. Despite belonging to civilizations separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and centuries of independent development, with no meaningful contact connecting any of them during the periods these mythologies first took shape, each culture arrived at remarkably similar core imagery, a large, powerful, serpentine or reptilian creature, closely associated with water, weather, or the boundary between different realms of existence. This is not a small coincidence easily dismissed. It represents one of the most widespread, independently repeated patterns found anywhere across global mythology, a detail that has fascinated historians, anthropologists, and mythologists for generations, each searching for some deeper, unifying explanation behind why this particular creature kept appearing, again and again, across civilizations that could not possibly have influenced one another directly. Some scholars have pointed toward shared human psychology as a possible thread connecting all of these traditions together. Others have looked toward the natural world itself, ancient encounters with large snakes, crocodiles, or even fossilized remains, as a possible spark igniting remarkably similar imaginative leaps across entirely separate parts of the globe. As we pause here, having traveled across China, Europe, Scandinavia, Japan, Mesoamerica, and Eastern Europe, a natural question settles quietly into place. If none of these civilizations ever met, never shared stories, never exchanged so much as a single word across their respective languages, how did they all arrive at something so remarkably similar? What could possibly explain dragons appearing, independently and repeatedly, in the mythology of nearly every major civilization scattered across the ancient world? Several genuinely compelling theories have emerged over the decades, ranging from shared human psychology and ancient encounters with dinosaur fossils, to ancient fears of large predatory animals, to deeper questions about how the human mind processes fear, power, and the unknown itself. Each explanation offers a different piece of a puzzle that, even now, remains only partially solved. There is still considerably more of this story left to explore, the specific theories researchers have proposed, the fossil discoveries that may have shaped ancient imagination, and a final, deeper reflection on what this shared, independent mythology might reveal about the human mind itself, regardless of where or when it happens to be found, separated by ocean, language, and thousands of years of history, yet somehow arriving at remarkably the same place, again and again, across nearly every corner of the ancient world. One of the most frequently proposed explanations for this widespread pattern involves the discovery of large fossilized bones by ancient peoples who had no scientific framework for understanding what they were actually looking at. Long before paleontology existed as a formal discipline, ancient civilizations across the world occasionally stumbled upon the massive, fossilized remains of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures, weathered out of hillsides, riverbanks, and eroding cliff faces. Without any concept of extinct species stretching back millions of years, these discoveries likely demanded some kind of explanation, and dragons offered a remarkably convenient one, a large, powerful, reptilian creature capable of leaving behind bones of exactly this scale. Ancient Chinese texts, in fact, occasionally describe fossilized bones explicitly as dragon bones, and this belief persisted long enough that fossilized remains were sometimes ground into powder for traditional medicine, believed to carry some portion of the creature's legendary power. Scholars studying ancient Greek mythology have proposed similar connections, noting that several regions associated with dragon or griffin legends also happen to contain significant fossil deposits, suggesting ancient peoples encountering these remains may have woven them directly into evolving local mythology, shaping stories passed down long before anyone understood what these bones truly represented. Similar patterns have been noted across parts of Central Asia and North America too, regions rich in dinosaur fossils that also happen to carry their own local legends of buried, monstrous creatures, a connection modern paleontologists find genuinely difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence given how consistently it appears across such geographically separated fossil-rich regions. A second compelling theory focuses less on fossils and more on living animals ancient humans genuinely feared and regularly encountered. Large snakes, crocodiles, and monitor lizards were very real, very dangerous creatures across many parts of the ancient world, and researchers studying comparative mythology have pointed out that dragon imagery frequently combines features borrowed directly from these actual, living reptiles. Some anthropologists have gone further, suggesting an even deeper explanation rooted in evolutionary psychology itself. Humans, throughout our long evolutionary history, face genuine survival threats from snakes, large cats, and birds of prey, three categories of predator that dragons frequently combine into one single, composite creature: serpentine body, clawed limbs, sometimes wings or a raptor-like head. Under this theory, dragons may represent something close to an inherited, deeply embedded fear response, blending our ancestors' most consistent predatory threats into one single, universally recognizable imagined creature. This idea helps explain why dragon imagery feels intuitively frightening or powerful across such vastly different cultures, tapping into something considerably older and more fundamental than any single mythology or storytelling tradition, reaching back instead into shared, ancient patterns of human fear itself. Researchers studying this theory point out that young children across widely different modern cultures, with no exposure to dragon mythology whatsoever, often show heightened, instinctive alertness toward images of snakes specifically, a small but suggestive piece of evidence supporting the idea that certain fears really may run considerably deeper than culture or upbringing alone could explain. A third significant theory shifts focus away from fear entirely and toward humanity's relationship with the natural forces dragons so often represent: storms, floods, rivers, and the unpredictable power of weather itself. Across nearly every dragon tradition explored throughout this documentary, a consistent thread connects these creatures closely to water and weather: Chinese long controlling rain, Ryujin ruling the tides, European dragons occasionally linked to storms and destructive floods within certain regional folklore. Ancient agricultural societies depended enormously on predictable weather patterns, and unpredictable, occasionally violent natural events, sudden floods, devastating storms, unexplained droughts, may have naturally inspired the imagination of a powerful, living force capable of causing such dramatic, uncontrollable destruction. A dragon offered a way to personify these otherwise incomprehensible natural forces, giving early societies a narrative framework for something that would otherwise remain simply frightening and unexplained. This theory helps explain why so many dragon traditions blend reverence and fear together so closely: the same creature capable of bringing life-giving rain or devastating flood, reflecting the genuinely double-edged relationship ancient agricultural societies held with the natural forces controlling their survival. This same double-edged quality shows up again and again across nearly every tradition covered throughout this documentary, suggesting the emotional complexity built into dragon mythology may reflect something considerably more universal than any single culture's particular religious or agricultural circumstances alone. Let us pause here for a moment, resting quietly between these different theories and simply picturing a calmer scene instead. An ancient riverside village at dusk, storm clouds gathering slowly along a darkening horizon. Villagers gather near their homes, watching the sky nervously, murmuring old stories about the spirit believed to control the coming rain, whether it will arrive gently, nourishing their fields, or violently, sweeping away everything in its path. This same basic scene, in one form or another, likely played out across countless ancient communities scattered across entirely different continents, each culture developing its own particular explanation for the same fundamental uncertainty: the unpredictable, occasionally terrifying power of the natural world surrounding them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolls faintly across the darkening sky, and for just a moment, every eye in the village turns upward together, waiting to see which version of the old story tonight's storm has decided to tell, whether the spirit above intends to nourish their fields or test their patience once again. We will continue shortly, turning toward a deeper psychological explanation researchers have proposed, one suggesting the dragon myth may be considerably older and more universal than any single fear, fossil, or weather pattern alone could fully explain. Beyond fossils, predator fear, and weather symbolism, some researchers have proposed a deeper, more unifying psychological explanation entirely. The renowned mythologist Carl Jung suggested dragons might represent what he called an archetype, a symbol embedded deep within the collective human unconscious, appearing independently across separate cultures not because of shared history or environment, but because it reflects something fundamental about how the human mind itself processes chaos, danger, and the unknown. Under this framework, the dragon becomes less a specific creature and more a universal symbol representing whatever a particular culture perceives as its greatest, most primal threat: chaos versus order, destruction versus creation, the wild, uncontrolled forces of nature standing against organized human civilization. This would help explain why the specific details vary so considerably between cultures, while the underlying core concept, a powerful, dangerous, often reptilian force requiring either reverence or defeat, remains remarkably consistent. This theory does not necessarily contradict the fossil or predator-based explanations covered earlier. Instead, it suggests these more concrete, tangible triggers, actual bones, actual dangerous animals, actual destructive storms, may have simply given physical shape to a symbolic pattern the human mind was already inclined to create regardless of specific circumstance. Jung's broader theory of the collective unconscious remains genuinely debated among modern psychologists, some finding it compelling, others considerably more skeptical of any claim involving inherited, shared symbolism passed down across generations without direct cultural transmission. Even skeptics of the stronger version of this theory, though, often acknowledge that something about dragon imagery clearly resonates across an unusually wide range of otherwise unconnected human societies. Considering all of these theories together, rather than searching for one single, definitive answer, may ultimately offer the most complete and satisfying explanation available. Ancient peoples across the world genuinely did encounter massive fossilized bones they could not otherwise explain. They genuinely did fear large, dangerous reptiles and predators sharing their environment. They genuinely did experience unpredictable, sometimes devastating natural forces they desperately wanted to understand and, if possible, influence. Layered on top of all these tangible, real-world triggers sits something potentially even deeper, a shared psychological tendency toward creating powerful, composite symbols out of humanity's most consistent fears and uncertainties, regardless of which specific culture or century happens to be doing the imagining. Fossils and fearsome predators may have provided the raw physical material, while something more universal within human psychology shaped that material into the recognizable dragon figure appearing so consistently across the ancient world. This layered explanation feels considerably more satisfying than any single theory taken entirely on its own, acknowledging both the very real, tangible experiences ancient peoples shared, and the deeper, more universal patterns apparently embedded within human imagination itself. Rather than searching for the one correct answer among several competing theories, it may be more accurate to think of fossils, predators, weather, and psychology as four separate threads, each contributing its own particular strand toward the same rich, complicated tapestry of dragon mythology woven independently across the ancient world. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how remarkable this pattern truly is, when considered against the full scope of human history and geography. Civilizations separated by entire oceans, entirely different climates, entirely different languages and belief systems, arrived independently at creatures sharing serpentine bodies, reptilian scales, close association with water or sky, and a consistently complicated relationship combining both reverence and fear. This is not simply one culture borrowing from another through ancient trade routes or migration, a phenomenon anthropologists can trace clearly in many other shared mythological elements found across connected regions. Dragon mythology appears independently in civilizations with no plausible historical contact whatsoever, Mesoamerica and China representing perhaps the clearest example, separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years of completely independent cultural development, yet still arriving at strikingly similar core imagery. This genuine independence is precisely what makes the dragon myth such a compelling case study for researchers interested in universal patterns within human storytelling, offering rare, genuinely convincing evidence that certain ideas may be considerably less culturally specific than we typically assume, reaching instead into something shared much more broadly across human experience itself. Very few other mythological figures offer quite this same strength of evidence. Most shared story elements between distant cultures can eventually be traced back to some historical point of contact, however faint or indirect. Dragons, by contrast, keep appearing in places history simply cannot connect through trade, migration, or conquest, leaving this deeper, more universal explanation as one of the few genuinely plausible options remaining. Modern paleontology has added an interesting final layer to this whole story too, since we now understand with considerable scientific certainty that dinosaurs and other prehistoric reptiles genuinely did once roam across nearly every continent explored throughout this documentary. The fossilized remains ancient peoples occasionally discovered were not imagined or exaggerated. They were entirely real, tangible evidence of creatures that had actually existed, simply misunderstood within a framework lacking any concept of extinction or deep geological time. In this sense, dragons occupy a genuinely fascinating space between pure imagination and distorted historical memory, ancient peoples encountering real, physical evidence of creatures that truly once existed, then filling in the considerable gaps in their understanding with story, symbolism, and imagination shaped by their own particular cultural framework and fears. This blending of genuine physical evidence with creative, symbolic interpretation may ultimately represent the most accurate way to understand the dragon myth as a whole, neither pure fantasy invented from nothing, nor a simple, direct record of some single real creature, but something considerably more interesting sitting carefully between those two extremes. It is a genuinely fitting resolution to this entire story. Ancient peoples were not simply making things up out of thin air, nor were they accurately recording some single, literal monster. They were doing something far more human than either extreme, taking real, tangible evidence and weaving it carefully into meaning, story, and symbolism that helped make sense of a world still largely unexplained by anything resembling modern science. Let us settle once more into a final, quiet pause before gathering the last remaining threads of this remarkable story together. Picture, once more, those same scattered scenes explored throughout this documentary: a misty Chinese river, a shadowed European cave, the Great Norse World Tree, Ryugen's underwater palace, Quetzalcoatl's sunlit temple staircase, a Slavic village watching nervously for a multi-headed threat rising from the countryside beyond. Each scene distinct, shaped by its own particular culture, geography, and history, and yet each one circling back toward that same fundamental shape, appearing again and again across an ancient world where no single idea should have been able to travel so completely and so consistently without any direct contact connecting the people who imagined it. It is worth simply sitting with that image for a moment longer, 6 entirely separate corners of the ancient world, each quietly imagining nearly the same creature, entirely unaware that thousands of miles away, someone else was doing exactly the same thing. There remains a little more of this story left to explore, a final, broader reflection on what this remarkable, independently repeated mythology ultimately reveals about the shared nature of human imagination itself, regardless of where or when that imagination happens to take root, across deserts, rivers, mountains, and coastlines separated by nearly every ocean the ancient world had to offer. Bringing together everything explored across this documentary so far, a genuinely remarkable picture comes into focus. 6 entirely separate civilizations, spread across nearly every inhabited continent, each independently developing rich, detailed dragon mythology carrying its own particular symbolism, values, and cultural meaning, yet all circling back toward strikingly similar core imagery, a powerful, often reptilian creature tied closely to water, weather, chaos, or the boundary between different realms of existence. Fossil discoveries, genuine predator fear, unpredictable natural forces, and perhaps something even deeper within shared human psychology all likely played some role in shaping this remarkably consistent pattern, layered together across thousands of years and countless separate cultures that could never have influenced one another directly. 6 traditions, 6 wildly different personalities given to the same essential creature, sacred protector, treasure-hoarding villain, world tree knower, sea-ruling god, feathered sky serpent, chaotic multi-headed threat, and yet all of them somehow reaching for the very same fundamental shape when imagination needed a form powerful enough to carry it. There remains one final question worth sitting with as this documentary approaches its close: what this shared, independently repeated mythology ultimately says about the deeper, universal threads connecting human imagination across every corner of the ancient world, regardless of ocean, language, or the many centuries separating one civilization from another. A question this story will spend its final moments quietly reflecting upon. Before reaching a final reflection, it is worth pausing on a few additional traditions not yet covered, since the dragon myth reaches even further across the ancient world than the 6 cultures already explored. In India, the Naga, a serpent deity often depicted with human upper bodies and serpentine lower halves, held enormous religious significance across both Hindu and Buddhist tradition, associated with water, fertility, and the underworld, guarding treasures and sacred sites throughout numerous ancient temples still standing today. Nagas were considered neither purely good nor purely evil, capable of bringing rain and prosperity when honored properly, or drought and misfortune when disrespected, a moral complexity echoing similar patterns found within Chinese and Slavic dragon traditions explored earlier in this documentary. Elaborate Naga sculptures still guard the entrances of temples across India, Thailand, and Cambodia today, their coiled, serpentine bodies often stretching along staircases in a design bearing a striking resemblance to the sunlit serpent illusion created at Mesoamerican temples half a world away. This resemblance, though almost certainly coincidental given the total absence of contact between these 2 regions during the relevant historical periods, offers yet another striking example of just how consistently separate civilizations arrived at remarkably similar symbolic and architectural choices when representing this same imagined creature. Buddhist tradition carried Naga imagery even further across Asia, spreading alongside religious teaching into Southeast Asia, Tibet, and beyond, each region adapting the Naga slightly differently while retaining its core association with water, protection, and the boundary between the human and spiritual worlds. Aboriginal Australian mythology contributes yet another entirely independent thread to this global pattern, one considerably older than nearly any other tradition explored throughout this documentary. The rainbow serpent, a central figure within numerous Aboriginal creation stories passed down across tens of thousands of years, is often credited with carving rivers and valleys into the landscape during the Dreamtime, the foundational creation period central to Aboriginal spiritual belief. Unlike many other dragon traditions covered so far, the rainbow serpent carries a particularly direct connection to the physical land itself, with specific rivers, waterholes, and rock formations across Australia identified within local tradition as places the serpent actually created or once passed through during its ancient, foundational journey across the continent. Given that Aboriginal Australian culture developed in near total isolation from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, considerably longer than nearly any other tradition explored in this documentary, the presence of a powerful, serpentine creator figure tied closely to water and landscape offers particularly compelling evidence for just how deeply and independently this pattern of imagination seems to recur across humanity as a whole. The rainbow serpent remains actively honored within Aboriginal culture today, its stories continuing to be passed down through generations exactly as they always have, a living tradition rather than simply an ancient relic studied only from the outside by curious historians. West African mythology adds its own distinct thread as well, particularly through Ado Huido, a rainbow serpent deity found within Dahomey and broader Vodun spiritual tradition, said to have carried the creator deity across the world during creation itself, its movement shaping mountains and valleys much like the Aboriginal rainbow serpent achieved on an entirely separate continent using strikingly similar imagery. Ado Huido is often depicted encircling the entire world, biting its own tail in a closed loop, a specific symbolic detail that appears independently in several entirely unconnected traditions worldwide, including the Norse concept of Jormungand, a massive serpent encircling the earth itself within Norse cosmology, and the ancient Greek Ouroboros symbol representing cyclical time and eternal renewal. This particular recurring detail, a serpent so large it wraps entirely around the world, appearing independently across West Africa, Scandinavia, and ancient Greece, offers one of the most striking examples anywhere in comparative mythology of entirely separate cultures arriving at nearly identical symbolic imagery, developed through completely independent religious and philosophical traditions separated by vast distances and centuries of history. This world-encircling serpent motif appears frequently enough across unconnected traditions that some researchers consider it among the strongest pieces of evidence for shared, universal patterns within human mythology, a symbol seemingly too specific and too consistent to have emerged purely by random chance across so many separate cultures. Let us pause once more here, resting quietly and simply reflecting on just how far this pattern actually extends once every tradition gets properly accounted for. China, Japan, Europe, Scandinavia, Mesoamerica, Eastern Europe, India, Aboriginal Australia, West Africa, each entirely separate, each developing its own detailed, culturally specific dragon or serpent tradition, and yet nearly all of them circling back toward remarkably similar core themes: creation, water, chaos, boundary crossing, and a serpent so vast it sometimes encircles the world itself. It becomes genuinely difficult, once the full global picture comes properly into focus, to dismiss this pattern as simple coincidence or isolated cultural borrowing. Something considerably more fundamental appears to be at work here, some deep, shared thread running through human imagination regardless of where or when a particular civilization happens to take root. 9 separate traditions, spread across nearly every inhabited continent on Earth, arriving independently at variations on the very same basic theme, feels less like coincidence the more carefully it gets examined, and more like a genuine window into something shared deeply across the human experience itself. We will move next toward gathering these final reflections together, considering what this remarkable, worldwide pattern ultimately suggests about the nature of human storytelling and imagination itself. One particularly interesting angle worth considering involves how children across entirely different modern cultures respond to dragon imagery today, long after these ancient mythologies first took shape. Studies in developmental psychology have found that children exposed to dragon stories for the very first time, regardless of their own cultural background, tend to process the creature intuitively as powerful, dangerous, and somehow ancient, without needing extensive explanation or cultural context beforehand. This intuitive, near-universal response suggests something about dragon imagery taps into recognition patterns considerably more basic than specific cultural teaching alone could fully account for. A child raised entirely outside any of the traditions explored throughout this documentary still tends to respond to a dragon's basic shape, reptilian, large, often winged, in broadly similar ways to children raised within cultures where dragon mythology remains actively practiced and celebrated. This continuity between ancient independent invention and modern universal recognition offers a small but meaningful piece of supporting evidence for the deeper psychological theories discussed earlier, suggesting the dragon myth may reflect something considerably more fundamental about how human minds process certain shapes, certain combinations of danger and power, regardless of specific time period or cultural background. It is also worth considering how thoroughly dragons have persisted into modern storytelling, despite most people today living comfortably removed from the ancient fears, fossil discoveries, and unpredictable natural forces that likely helped shape these myths in the first place. Modern literature, film, and popular culture continue drawing heavily on dragon imagery, suggesting whatever originally sparked this pattern across ancient civilizations has not simply faded away alongside the specific circumstances that first created it. This persistence hints at something genuinely durable about the dragon as a symbolic figure, powerful enough to remain culturally relevant and emotionally resonant across thousands of years of continued human storytelling, adapting easily into entirely new contexts and mediums while retaining its core symbolic power largely intact. Few other mythological figures have managed this same remarkable longevity and cross-cultural staying power, surviving the transition from ancient oral tradition through medieval epic poetry, temple architecture, religious ritual, and eventually into modern film and literature, continuously reshaped yet somehow always recognizable across an almost unbroken chain stretching back thousands of years. Even audiences today, encountering a dragon for the first time in a modern film or novel, tend to intuitively grasp the creature's basic symbolic weight, power, danger, and something ancient, without needing any of the specific mythological background explored throughout this documentary, a small but telling sign of just how deeply this particular symbol has settled into shared human imagination. Considering everything gathered across this entire documentary, from the earliest Chinese river dragons through Aboriginal rainbow serpents carving ancient landscapes, a genuinely profound picture begins to settle into place. Human beings, entirely independently, across nearly every inhabited continent and across a span of many thousands of years, kept arriving at strikingly similar imagined creatures, without ever once being able to compare notes, share stories, or directly influence one another's imagination. This suggests something worth sitting with carefully, that certain patterns of human storytelling may reach considerably deeper than any single culture, religion, or historical period, tapping instead into something shared much more broadly across the human experience itself, shaped by common fears, common relationships with nature, and perhaps something even more fundamental within how the human mind processes power, danger, and the unknown. Whatever the precise underlying explanation ultimately turns out to be, this remarkable worldwide pattern stands as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence available anywhere in comparative mythology, that despite our vast cultural differences, human beings scattered across the ancient world were, in some very real sense, all quietly imagining the same thing. As this documentary approaches its close, it feels worth returning one final time to that opening image explored at the very beginning of this story: separate civilizations, oceans apart, no contact whatsoever, yet all independently imagining some form of the same powerful, reptilian creature. Having now traveled through China, Japan, Europe, Scandinavia, Mesoamerica, Eastern Europe, India, Aboriginal Australia, and West Africa, that original observation feels even more remarkable than it did at the very start. Every civilization explored throughout this journey shaped its own particular version of this creature according to its own unique values, fears, and relationship with the natural world: sacred protector here, dangerous villain there, world tree gnawer in one tradition, sea-ruling deity in another. And yet, underneath all of that rich cultural variation, the same fundamental shape kept emerging, again and again, entirely independently, across nearly every corner of the ancient world. It is a genuinely humbling thing to consider, that despite everything separating these civilizations, language, geography, centuries of history, human imagination itself seems to have followed some deeper, shared thread, reaching the same remarkable destination through countless entirely separate paths. There is a certain quiet beauty in recognizing this pattern for what it truly is, not proof of some single hidden connection linking every ancient culture together, but rather proof that entirely separate people, living entirely separate lives, kept independently discovering the same powerful symbol whenever imagination needed a shape large enough to carry it. Let us settle once more into a final, quiet pause before this documentary comes fully to rest. Picture, one last time, all the scenes explored throughout this long journey together: a misty Chinese river, a shadowed European cave, the vast Norse world tree, Ryugen's underwater palace, Quetzalcoatl's sunlit temple staircase, a Naga guarding an ancient Indian shrine, the rainbow serpent carving valleys across the Australian outback, Edo Huido encircling the world in West African tradition. Each scene entirely distinct, shaped by its own particular history and culture, and yet each one part of the very same remarkable, worldwide pattern: human beings everywhere, across thousands of years and countless separate civilizations, quietly imagining something strikingly similar, without ever once being able to compare notes across the vast distances separating them. There is something deeply moving in that thought, a reminder that despite everything dividing humanity across history, geography, and belief, certain deep threads of imagination seem to run remarkably consistent underneath it all. Whatever ultimately explains this pattern: shared fear, shared fossils, shared psychology, or some combination of all three woven together, it leaves behind one of the most quietly remarkable discoveries available anywhere in the study of human culture, that we are, in some very real and lasting sense, considerably more alike than the vast distances separating our ancestors would ever suggest. Bringing this entire journey together now, we have traveled across nearly every corner of the ancient world, tracing one single, remarkable pattern through Chinese rivers, European caves, Norse cosmology, Japanese seas, Mesoamerican temples, Slavic villages, Indian shrines, the Australian outback, and West African creation myth. 9 entirely separate civilizations, each developing its own rich, detailed dragon or serpent tradition, and yet all of them circling back toward strikingly similar core imagery, again and again, without any direct contact connecting the imaginations that first conceived them. Fossils, feared predators, unpredictable natural forces, and something perhaps considerably deeper within shared human psychology all likely played their own part in shaping this worldwide pattern, layered together across thousands of years into one of the most compelling examples anywhere in comparative mythology of humanity's shared imaginative instincts. This remains an active area of genuine scholarly debate, and likely will for a long time to come, since no single explanation fully accounts for every detail across every tradition explored throughout this documentary. What remains clear, though, is simply how remarkable the underlying pattern itself truly is: civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years, somehow, again and again, imagining the same ancient, powerful creature. And so, gently, we arrive at the end of this long journey across the ancient world. We began with a single question: why civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years, with no contact whatsoever, kept independently imagining some form of the same powerful, reptilian creature. We traveled from Chinese rivers to European caves, from the Norse world tree to Ryugyin's underwater palace, from Quetzalcoatl's sunlit temple staircase to Slavic villages watching nervously for a multi-headed threat, and further still, into Indian shrines, the Australian outback, and West African creation myth. 9 entirely separate civilizations, each shaping this same core imagery according to its own particular values, fears, and relationship with the natural world, sacred protector in one tradition, dangerous villain in another, world-encircling serpent in several more, and yet all of them circling back, again and again, towards something remarkably similar, without ever once being able to compare notes across the vast distances separating them. Fossils, feared predators, unpredictable weather, and something considerably deeper within shared human psychology all likely played their own quiet part in shaping this worldwide pattern, layered together across countless generations into one of the most compelling reminders available anywhere in human history that our imaginations, however distant our histories, may be considerably more connected than we ever fully realize. Thank you for spending this time exploring one of the most remarkable, quietly shared mysteries the ancient world has ever left behind. If this journey through humanity's dragons helped you see the world a little differently tonight, consider liking the video, subscribing for more slow, thoughtful stories like this one, and sharing your own thoughts down in the comments below. Sleep peacefully, and good night.